It's now my great pleasure to welcome Professor Olivier Zunz, with whom my friendship goes back several decades, and who, like Tocqueville, has always been one of those very few French people who really gets America. Professor Zunz is the James Madison Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Virginia, Mr. Jefferson's University. He's also the author of a number of important works in American history, beginning with The Changing Face of Inequality, Urbanization, Industrial Development, and Immigrants in Detroit, 1880 to 1920, of Making America Corporate, 1870 to 1920, of Why the American Century, and of course of Philanthropy in America, a history about which he will be talking tonight. But I would be very remiss if I did not also mention his forthcoming book, The Man Who Understood Democracy, The Life of Alexis de Tocqueville, which will doubtless be the standard biography for decades to come, and which will be appearing sometime this spring from Princeton University Press. So without further ado, let me welcome Professor Zunz. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan, for this kind introduction. And my thanks also go to the center, to the Benson Center for their invitation. So I want to talk to you about the political economy of American philanthropy, having spent many years writing a history of philanthropy. And perhaps I should begin this presentation by telling you how, as a US historian, I came to write this book in the first place, because it was not a topic of much interest really to anybody around me, to historians who said, why are you writing this book? I had, of course, some modest acquaintance with giving as a fundraiser for a few local organizations and a few causes, on occasional modest giver, like all of us. But the idea emerged really from my work as a historian, and in a kind of the most unexpected way. Alan just mentioned had written a book called Why the American Century. It's a book I wrote in the 1990s, I guess at the height of globalization, with the spread of American model across the world, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the feeling we had won the Cold War. So the title was not just The American Century, but Why the American Century? And I wanted to figure out how this country was able to gain the kind of power in the first place in its history, how it was able, especially to assert its power during the First World War, massively and rapidly. Of course, one of the main reasons was the collapse of Europe. So there was a void there and a place to take. Europeans had become very good at killing each other. They were excellent at it. But I think Americans did far more than just filling the void. In the preceding 20, 30 years, 40 years before the First World War, Americans had engineered a major organizational revolution, a complete reorganization of production, of science, of industrial production, of science, of consumerism, an organizational revolution that included the big business corporation, and with it, and partly a product of it, we tend to forget this in academia, the American Research University, funded by very big donors. Altogether, the creation of a matrix of knowledge for science and technology that didn't exist before. Maybe some of you know how many graduate students working on the doctorate existed in America in the 1870s. Was it 100, 2,000, 5,000? Well, in the whole country in 1870, there were 30 graduate students working on doctorates. If you wanted to have a doctorate, you go to Germany or to England, but you didn't stay home. 30 years later, in 1900, there were already 3,000. It was quite a difference. And when I looked at the funding of science at the time to write this book on how America became powerful, how it created this new matrix of knowledge, including the University of Chicago's and the Johns Hopkins and the Stanford and the corporate labs that went with it. And long before there was an NSF or an NIH or an IMH, all the money came from philanthropy. So if you were a physicist or an astronomer or a chemist and you wanted money for your project, you went to see the Rockefeller Foundation, or before that, you went to see the Rockefellers, or you went to see the Andrew Carnegie and the Carnegie Corporation. And this was a discovery to me. I never realized the extent to which all of this funding came from, this funding that transformed America came from philanthropists. And all of a sudden I realized, gee, there's a huge topic here in American history that pretty much nobody has really written the history of it in a systematic, important way. But how often in the life of a historian do you find an important topic that hasn't been studied? So that was enough for me to go ahead. So tonight I want to my story for the evening is not so much the story of that book that I wrote in the 90s. The story for the evening is the story of this new philanthropy, not the history of Christian charity in America, not the story of almsgiving, how you give money away to the poor, but the history of philanthropy as the quest for root causes, the root causes of large problems, and the way you find solutions, and the history of philanthropy as investment in society, not so much as giving as investing. Giving money away for large purposes, those philanthropists and the people who helped them found that it was often much harder than making the money in the first place. And many philanthropists found that out the hard way with failed investments. I think I can best illustrate the way in which philanthropy worked, this big philanthropy, by telling you how Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate, the best known rags to riches American story, managed to enlarge American scientific education dramatically in the late 19th and early 20th century. Most American colleges, until fairly early in the 20th century, were still small religious denominational colleges. They provided still very little by way of scientific education. Worst, aging professors like me didn't retire. They couldn't afford it. So to rejuvenate the faculty throughout America, Carnegie created a pension fund, which became widely popular. Still exists, by the way. I'm beginning to draw on it. Those colleges who received the money, not all of them, a handful of them to begin with, could suddenly attract faculty talent that was not available before, with the promise of good benefit, and at the same time, they could now get rid of deadwood. But Carnegie, in giving out this retirement money, in funding what is now TIAA, added a twist that turned out to be critical for American science. He told those colleges they wouldn't let them access the retirement money unless they hired real scientists and started a curriculum in science. And you know what? Everybody loudly protested Presbyterian Princeton, still a small Presbyterian college, didn't want to hear it. Methodist Northwestern wanted to have nothing to do with it. Baptist Brown didn't want to change their curriculum. A score of other schools first, but pretty quickly they all gave in. The deal was too good. And pretty quickly, scientific education blossoms throughout all of these colleges. I think this is the best case scenario how philanthropy works. Philanthropy think of giving as a form of investment rather than a traditional gift, except of course that the investment doesn't generate personal profit. All profits are then reinvested in the cause. Massive investment in science and technology was of course critical to the successful American intervention in the war. The stabilization of ships, the stabilization of airplanes, that is the beginning of precision bombing, the detection of submarines, you name it. The radio that made it possible to communicate at sea without semaphoric signs. Now, this transformation, of course, began with the creation of huge fortunes in the Gilded Age, with that generation of the so-called robber barons, and their investment in the scientific matrix, which I just described in both terms. There was a big idea with it, and Carnegie is the one that best defined this big idea. That yes, he was very rich, yes, he made a huge fortune, but the money was not his. And that was a big idea. The money belonged to the society that made him rich. That's what he basically wrote in the Gospel of Wealth, the piece he wrote in the 1880s that is still considered as one of the founding documents of modern philanthropy. The money he had accumulated was not really his. So here he was, this social Darwinist, infatuated with himself, kind of a pest in a way, decided that, okay, his fortune belonged to the people who made it possible for him to acquire it. He was not going just to give it away. He had to spend it for a purpose and create an organization that could do it. Now, there's a direct line, by the way, from Andrew Carnegie to Bill Gates. It is the same idea. So that idea has survived. Now, impulse came from some of the very rich, not all of them. But to achieve their goals, Carnegie and other wealthy donors needed the help of experts and people in the know. So the much heralded shift from charity to philanthropy could not have happened without a partnership between the rich who had made their careers as organizational wizards in the great industrial expansion of the late 19th century, but because of an alliance with a growing number of elites in the academic worlds, in local government, in the judiciary, in emerging professional associations. Together, and I insist on the together, they figured out how to put the new money to work for science, to work for education, to work for public health. They recognized that heretofore unavailable fortunes constituted a very important public resource for social progress. And from the East Coast and Midwestern centers of capitalist development, the alliance spread to the South. Now, so the alliance of rich and reformers was very big. Impulse also came from reformers without the rich who had no money at all. Who created at the same time that this big money philanthropy emerged, were created at the same time, and the chronological coincidence is significant, a mass philanthropy, a philanthropy of nickel and dimes, which also tackled huge problems. And this mass philanthropy of nickel and dimes became a routine part of American life. We're all called on routinely to give money for the fight against major diseases, to help victims of natural disasters, and so on. Now, tuberculosis was one of the worst killers in this country early in the century, somewhere between 10 and 50% of death, which was huge. But early in the 20th century, no wealthy donors had thought of investing in a cure, even though there was a growing understanding of the germ theory of disease. Yet, an immigrant from Denmark by the name of Jacob Riis, working as a journalist for the New York Tribune, following cops and making arrests and becoming a famous pioneer in photography by taking photography of tenement life and campaigning for cleaning up the slums. Jacob Riis launched the first mass fundraising campaign in the country. Riis had seen 6 brothers die of tuberculosis. In 1904, he received a Christmas letter from Copenhagen, from his native Denmark, bearing a peculiar seal in addition to the traditional postage stamp, a Christmas seal. The Danish postal official had the idea, embraced by his government, of selling those extra stamps, seals, to raise money to build a local hospital near Copenhagen to take care of tuberculosis patients. And in a couple of years, they had raised the money. We told the story of this highly successful penny subscription in a progressive magazine named Outlook, and urged the duplication of this kind of fundraising in the US. And he said 2 things that were important. He said, well, no millionaires had thought of it before, and by the way, we don't need them. We'll do it better ourselves. And then he said, well, Denmark is a small country. America is a big country. So we'll do it better here, and we'll have more reach. And of course, this is what happened. And the TB Society, the Tuberculosis Society, with small donations, preceded the creation of the Rockefeller Foundation, which was created in 1913. So it's really interesting to see how these 2 movements merged into making philanthropy a part of American daily life. And realizing this gave me the incentive of writing this book. Modern philanthropy emerging as a combination of these 2 trends, top-down trend and bottom-up trend, which converge to create a huge sectors of foundations, charities, nonprofit organizations. Now, how large? How large? And now, if you allow me to make a big jump from these fairly modest beginnings to the huge nonprofit sector we know now, a sector created, a nonprofit sector largely created by for-profit capitalism. The nonprofit sector accounts for about 6% of gross domestic product and about 10% of the workforce. And that's been pretty constant in the last quarter of a century from the statistics I've been following. Now, the Defense Department is under 5% of gross domestic product. So philanthropy is greater than the Pentagon. I mean, it gives you a sense of how you should think about it. Taken together, the nonprofit budget comes from 4 principal sources. And now that's significant. There was annual gift from donors big and small, including money solicited through mass fundraising campaign. Of course, none of that money is spent. So the second source is return on a variety of endowments. You know, think the Harvard endowment, think the Yale endowment, think the Benson Center endowment. So big endowments, small endowments, huge endowments, small endowments. Net income earned in performing functions, because many non-profit organizations perform functions and they charge for it. I mean, universities are non-profit organizations and you pay tuition. And then the last part, which became greater and greater and greater, is government subsidies. Now, who knows, for example, that Catholic Charities is over 50% funded by the federal government? Okay, I'll get to that a bit later. Now, so nonprofits, the nonprofit sector, which of course is greater than philanthropy, but is largely its creation, a hybrid capitalist creation that operates tax-free so long as profits are reinvested in the common good. But this nonprofit sector retains many of the characteristics of for-profit enterprises. What I mean by that is that, for instance, funds that remain in endowment are managed according to market principle. I mean, behind the scene, that's what's happening. They don't return to, they are not ever used for the profit of stockholders. Now, let me move on to the next point, that is, this enormous growth of the nonprofit sector was never supposed to happen according to 19th century strictures. In the 19th century, most gifts were very limited by law. Let me explain. From times immemorial, in British common law, gifts had to be very specifically designated. And donor intent had to be very clearly stated and then quickly observed. Now, what was going on there? Most gifts were through bequest. And of course, heirs coming from wealthy families who for many years were looking forward to becoming someday rich were pretty disappointed when discovering in reading their parents' wills that the money would go to the local hospital or to the local orphanage or be used for sailors' widows, but they would get only a fraction of it, and maybe only a small fraction of it. And more often than not, heirs went to court to invalidate the wills. And the courts would side with heirs if the gifts were vague or if trustees were not specified. So to withstand challenges in court, judges, which pretty much until the 16th Amendment, that is the question of the income tax, were regulators of philanthropy, to withstand challenges in court, judges could say, well, the gift is very specific and it's valid. It has good management, and there is no reason, it's for the common good, it's for the public good, and there is no reason to challenge it. If, for example, however, the gift was not specifically designed or could be changed, or the donors were not trustworthy, the recipients were not trustworthy, and then heirs could recover the money pretty quickly. And there was no limits as to when this could happen. That is, heirs could sue recipients generations after the money was given, if they realized that the money was no longer used according to donor intent. This is actually still partly the case. This hasn't really gone away, as the administration at Princeton realized a few years ago, painfully, after they lost a lot of money because they had diverted the fellowship fund from the original donor intent, and the family finding out sued them and won. Judges had some flexibility, and they used it as often as they could for the common good. They could apply the doctrine that was named the doctrine of Cyprus, coming from the French word aussi près or as close as possible to the donor intent. And of course, judges recognize that history, that things changed, that needs changed, but so long as they could argue that under new circumstances, the donor will was respected, then they authorized the change. But often that couldn't be done, and the heirs recovered the money. Some gifts were remarkably small and specific. Julius Rosenwald, maybe the name is familiar to you, the founder of Sears, the great American company. You know, FDR used to say that if he had only one book to give to a Russian, it would be the Sears catalog. So that great American company that recently closed its doors, unfortunately, the Rosenwald, who built thousands of elementary schools for Black kids in the South, fought for many years to open up philanthropy, to move away from these strictures of strict donor intent and strict definition. He described this very small gift as hopelessly limited. In a piece he wrote in a magazine in the 1920s, he described a gift that the donor had made to Bryn Mawr College, a small women's college, in the 1890s, to provide the young women of the college with a baked potato at every meal. Well, there had been some issues with food supply before, and that was his solution. But that was the only way the college could spend the money. And the young women in the college didn't want it because they were concerned, more worried about their figure than the use of the gift. That may have been an extreme case. But the precondition for modern philanthropy to emerge was to break this mold, to make it possible to change this. And this is what the alliance of rich donors and progressive reformers really did. Not just helping rich people to spend their money well, but to actually break this legal mold. So a generation later, when the Rockefeller opened their foundation in 1913, in their charter, they said that the foundation money was to be used for the good of mankind. So what is the philanthropic revolution? It is the shift in one generation from giving money for a baked potato at every meal to giving money for the good of mankind. Not a small trip. Okay. That revolution was the outcome of many long court battles. Now, I just want to mention one. The most famous episode was the creation of the Tilden Trust for the building of the New York Public Library. Now, Samuel Tilden was a popular Democratic governor. He made his fortune in corporate law, working for the railroads, and he ran for president, and won the popular vote in 1876. But Rutherford Hayes went to the White House instead. There was one contested vote, where in Florida, of course, and an electoral commission sided for Hayes after Hayes agreed to end Reconstruction and remove federal troops from the South. It's a well-known episode in American history, the Compromise of 1876. Tilden Hayes was all over the news in 2000 when Bush Gore replayed a similar scenario, as some of you may remember. Tilden had no children, he had no kids, and didn't expect his nephews or nieces to go to court to break the will and get this money. But they did, and they succeeded, thus blocking for a while the construction of the New York Public Library. The will had a clause that if for some reason the library couldn't be built, then the trustees could decide another worthy cause for the good of mankind. That was vague. That was vague. Vague enough So the heirs, who actually had been provided pretty well by their uncle, won their challenge. It took years in court for New York progressive reformers to go from appeal to appeal until in the end, the legislature changed the law. Tilden died in 1886. In 1893, New York State passed the Tilden Act, making it possible in the state of New York to leave a bequest undefined and put the trustees in charge of redefining the goals for each generation. In effect, passing the power of regulation from the judge under Cypress to the trustee. Cypress never completely disappeared, as I mentioned earlier, and donor intent and how much respected is still a major issue in philanthropic circles. But the Tilden Act, soon replicated everywhere around the country, is the little-known birth act of modern philanthropy. Now, we are all, I don't know, but I assume so, we're all law-abiding citizens in this room and beyond. So it seems obvious to all of us is that when we give money away, or when donors give money away, they should respect the law and give only to legal causes. But that's not true when it comes to philanthropy. It is not obvious at all. And why? Because there are many bad laws. And therefore, philanthropists have to work to replace the bad laws by good laws. But by doing so, they put often themselves in a position where they challenge the law. And this is most often the case in the era of civil rights, as I will say in a second. And as philanthropy expanded, and as the federal government passed in the 16th Amendment, ratified it in 1913 and then implemented it, and with it implemented the tax exemption for giving. I'm not going to get into that history, which is fairly complicated, but which is extremely important. More and more, the regulation of philanthropy, after moving from the judge to the trustee, moved from the trustee to the IRS in deciding when to grant and when to remove the tax exemption that was increasingly significant as the tax grew bigger and bigger after the 16th Amendment. A gift must be applied consistently within the existing laws, wrote Massachusetts Chief Justice Horace Gray in Jackson v. Phillips, a famous civil rights case of the Reconstruction years. The bounty must be according to the law, not against the law. Now, the case Judge Gray was adjudicating was a gift Boston merchant Francis Jackson made in 1861 when he bequeathed his fortune to a prominent group of abolitionists, 1861, and feminists. The gift was made to help African Americans escape slavery and then promote the right to vote for women. The heirs claimed that the trust had failed simply because the 13th Amendment had abolished slavery, so one couldn't so the gift to help slaves gain freedom was obsolete. The judge, however, held that the doctrine of Cypress worked in this case because the donor intent was to help African Americans in freedom, and that was applicable in this case. But the same Judge Gray denied the validity of the gift for women's rights because it was aimed directly at changing the laws, and it couldn't be, and even though its object, it agreed with it, couldn't be accomplished without changing the Constitution. Now, It took a while, of course, for that to happen, and it eventually happened with the 19th Amendment. But could the IRS, as it became increasingly the regulator of philanthropy, grant a tax exemption if the gift was for a cause that was not yet legal, or at least not yet legal? Well, a famous case, of course, is that of the fight for birth control. In the progressive era, birth control was illegal. It was even birth control was actively practiced by the Protestant middle class, but it was never legal, and it actually didn't become fully legal, as some of you probably know, until the 1960s, 1965, Griswold v. Connecticut, where one could use contraceptive without a doctor's prescription. In the progressive era, even medical literature on birth control was classified as pornographic. Medical journals would not print it, or they would lose their mailing permit. Margaret Sanger went to jail. Often, actually, she engineered her own arrest. She was a great publicist for her cause. Every time she opened a birth control clinic and distributed birth control literature. Her wealthy husband, Noah Slee, funded her birth control clinics. Slee went definitely broke when the IRS denied him the tax exemption time and again. Now, in 1936, Margaret Sanger won a major court battle when the court finally won recognition for her clinics, legal recognition for her clinics. But that didn't change the IRS decision on her husband's fortune. And then Sanger, who couldn't use her husband's money any longer, by the way, she had convinced he was in love with her, and she was not in love with him, and she married him only on the condition that once he would they lived apart, and B, he funded her clinics, and he accepted both conditions. Men in love do crazy things. This said, as Sanger could not access his money anymore because the IRS was not going along, she turned to mass philanthropy to pursue the task. So the circle is closed. I could cite many other examples, except I only have 7 or 9 minutes left to the lecture. But to cut to the chase, how did we resolve this issue between fighting against bad laws or trying to change them, and therefore finding yourself against the law, and respecting the law? The solution has been to draw, at least in words, a sharp distinction between educating and advocating, between education and politics. If you want to keep your tax exemption, be recognized as a charity, and yet give to a politically controversial cause, do not lobby, do not get into politics. Do not try to change the law. Limit your action strictly to educational material. You can educate, but you cannot advocate. Now, perhaps the most famous example in this fictional distinction, I insist this fictional distinction, is the Sierra Club. Here we are in Colorado. In the 60s, the Sierra Club fought tooth and nail to prevent the building of dams on the Colorado River. Then they took a full-page ad in the New York Times, and which was fine. But at the bottom of the page, they included a little cutout that the reader could cut out to send to sign a petition and send it to the local congressman. That was politics. In retaliation, immediately the IRS removed the tax exemption club from tax exemption from the Sierra Club. The club recovered it later, but nonetheless, that tells you exactly what I'm talking about. Now, practically, what did it do? I've had countless conversations with foundations officials who argued that they never did politics when they spent all their time doing it. Philanthropic regulation, it seems to me, has raised the art of equivocation in American culture to unforeseen altitudes. In my view, it has contributed to make equivocating a trait of national character, if I'm allowed to use a concept that we have not used for a long time. Now, in the last 5-6 minutes I have left, I want to shift the conversation from the state as regulator of private philanthropy to partner in saying a word about the growing public-private partnership in philanthropy and beyond the nonprofit sector. The state, in effect, is not only the regulator of philanthropy, but also has become its most important partner. I mentioned that earlier in the lecture in discussing the budget. And the reason is simple enough. As the federal budget grows, the state provides ever-increasing sums of money, but neither the expertise nor the staff. So where does that come from? The nonprofit sector does, in the process, provide the expertise and provide the staff. In the process, what is public and what is private is increasingly blurred. So going over the history of federal cooperation with civil society, and I'm going to go very fast here, I see not the uninterrupted growth of a Leviathan, as I think most were told all the time, taking initiatives away from private citizens, but the dynamic succession of experiments. President Hoover in the 20s, well, first as Secretary of Commerce in the 20s and then as president after 1928, he was one of the great engineers of voluntarism in the First World War, but he sought to make institutions of civil society full participants in the compound republic. He sought technical support from foundations for the Commerce Department, especially unrolling the Russell Sage Foundation, which was the first general purpose foundation in America, in providing expertise. And in disaster relief, he orchestrated the work of the Red Cross, of Community Chest, and other institutions of mass philanthropy. The T-test became the devastating Mississippi flood of 1927. Hoover was a great conductor of the vast relief operation. He established a clear chain of command to oversee how to house the displaced population. From Washington came the design of various programs, credit corporations, plans of shantytowns, but from non-federal sources, from business, from railroads, from philanthropy, came money and execution. That was his formula. Banks, commercial interests, businesses, philanthropy provided as much as 50% of what was needed to overcome. The Red Cross raised most of the money. Under Hoover direction, local grassroots organizations did the work, but the federal government gave the direction. I should add that the Red Cross turned a blind eye on the forced labor at gunpoint of Black sharecroppers on flooded Mississippi plantations. And that's also an important part of the story. But the gist of the trend I'm describing is that Hoover orchestrated a very big cooperation between the federal government and private money, whether it came from foundations like Russell Sage or mass philanthropy like the Red Cross. Roosevelt put an end to this. Roosevelt created a clear separation between the federal government and private money. And I followed the case in great detail to see how he did it. But basically, to sum it in a nutshell, Roosevelt didn't accept the idea that local wealth would go to local money, which was, of course, key to the associative state of Hoover. Roosevelt wanted the flexibility to move money from wealthy states to poor states as needed, and not encourage wealthy states to become richer with matching funds from the federal government, but instead having complete freedom to spend the money as he thought best. In 1933, Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's closest associate, issued a directive prohibiting the turning over of federal funds to a private agency. A complete 180. But of course, FDR being FDR, he made one exception for the Catholic Diocese of Chicago when he needed the votes of Illinois Catholics. But that's another story. In the period of significant expansion of the federal government during the Second World War, that followed the World War II, the federal government threatened philanthropy out of business altogether because the money was so big, the amount of money that was spent in federal organization was so large compared to private money. Economists began talking about government funding agencies as public philanthropy. Now, and to end there, before I get just to a word of conclusion, President Johnson's Great Society, LBJ's Great Society, changed all of this again, creating what has become and has remained since a mixed political economy, The partnership between government and civil society to address the large issues of job security, welfare, racial integrations, returned in the Great Society of the mid-60s, 40 years after Hoover had first attempted it, in a conservative faction, in return in a more liberal fashion. The federal government began subsidizing civil society organizations for welfare and social services. The Ford Foundation, an organization that came to know well, played a major role in developing a new model. Senator Moynihan called it inventing a new level of American government, bringing together federal, state, local government, and private nonprofit organizations to fund community action, where poor residents, at least in theory, set their own priorities and pursued their own welfare programs. Federal money increasingly came in the form of state contracts with nonprofits. Nonprofit for hire became the motto of the mixed political economy. Again, as I said earlier, Catholic services, Catholic charities soon got more than half of its funding from the federal government. For many organizations, dependency on the federal government was not worth it. Alan Pfeiffer, president of the Carnegie Corporations, kept complaining that these organizations lost their roots as true voluntary organizations, that their roots had not sunk into the social structure. But that was the new reality. The mixed political economy that supports the American nonprofit sector began in the Great Society, really continued, began for good in the Great Society, continued to expand, dominate the political economy, either directly or through the states, first with categorical grants that demanded results in some sectors, then in block grants that gave local governments much greater flexibility, going to a variety of organizations, even in the 21st century, going to faith-based organizations, to churches, in a way that never existed before. So I want to stop here by saying this original fusion of private and public funds to deliver social service to the country, this mixed political economy, a history of which I have briefly summarized, has really survived the challenges of federal retrenchment and is now again at the very forefront of our political debates. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very stimulating presentation. So the floor is now open both in Zoom land, excuse me, and here in person for questions. So if you're here in person, raise a hand. If you're in Zoom, remember, use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and the question will get forwarded to me to present to Professor Zunz. So to begin with, those of you present, yes.
My question is about the effects of the change in the law that you described from giving to specific persons to giving to humanity in general, and how that changes the character of people over time. So Aristotle distinguishes the virtue of generosity, which is giving to specific people, from the virtue of magnificence, which is giving to society in general. And wealthy people in the ancient world were expected to contribute to great projects in society within the tax base and so on. So it seems like the change in the law seems to reflect that. We moved from a generosity-based system of giving to a philanthropic-based system of giving, where the object of the person receiving the gift was unspecified, right? And so there seems to be a difference there between, care for specific people, trying to be generous towards specific people, versus care for humanity in general. And many people have criticized that idea that to care for humanity in general is to care for no specific person, right? And so I wonder whether you think that that change in the law was significant in terms of changing the character of the people to be one that was based in perhaps some kind of Christian sense of generosity to a sort of more universalist, cosmopolitan sense of.
I don't know if I can summarize that question easily for those of you in the Zoom world, but the question is basically, how has the legal change from gifts permissible if they have a very narrow scope to gifts permissible to the aid of humanity in general, parallel perhaps a moral change from generosity to individuals who to a more cosmopolitan sense of what gift giving means? Is that a fair enough summary?
No, it's a very important question, and I mean, Tocqueville actually reflected on this in saying that in aristocratic societies, everybody belongs to a chain with a clear position in society, and therefore one takes care of people, one serves people above and takes care of people below, but there's always a clearly designated person, recipient of action. While in democratic societies, there's a greater inclination and appreciation of humankind, but in effect, a much less investment, a much lower investment in real people and real persons. And the risk is that this generosity gets diluted in a vague feeling of humanity, but in the end, people will die in the solitude of their own heart. So it's a very important problem. Of course, the way I described it in the history of philanthropy here is that one had to solve this huge issue of deals that were too narrow to have an impact, and make it possible for large gifts to be redefined by each generation. So I think that was certainly a very beneficial movement. But the criticism that one feels good about, there's a feel-good feeling about giving to, humanity without effort is very true. It's very true, and I think and I think it's an important moral issue. So and so I think you pose the questions where, as it very often is the case, and I'm not escaping the obligation to answer, but it's one of those cases where the question is more important than the answer. You just have to live with the question.
Thank you. Yes, go ahead.
Do you have any comments or opinions about philanthropies, or actually donors or recipients who have received philanthropic gifts from questionable organizations? And specifically, I'm talking about the Sackler family.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
opioid situation.
yeah, yeah.
Where you see large cultural institutions taking a name off, giving money back. And what would be your opinion on it?
Well, just let me repeat that for our Zoom audience. So the question is the views of Professor Zunz on what happens when an organization receives a donation from a questionable source, for example, from the Sackler family, and the trend to refuse those donations, give them back, change names, etc. Okay, so I want to answer this a little differently, because, well, the extent to which the Sacklers were greedy and guilty, I'm not in a position to say. That's clearly obvious. What I want to say is that of course, there's been a very large misuse of philanthropy throughout history. Much of it, I mean, I mentioned many of it in my history of philanthropy. I mean, you know, the Ford Foundation was created as a tax dodge. Okay, so clearly, in order to keep control of the company, Henry Ford moved 90% of the stock to a foundation that for a while was just not doing anything, and it's really his grandson, under really pressures from the IRS, that created a real foundation. So the world's largest foundation in the 60s, where, you know, if you're an African government, you probably ought to be in pretty good terms with the Ford Foundation, more important than Washington. Was treated as a tax dodge. The list of misuse of misconduct is huge, and I made a point after analyzing the record of not writing yet another piece of muckraking on philanthropy, because I made the judgment, rightly or wrongly, I think rightly, that on balance, the outcome was positive. That is to say, that philanthropic organizations created a much greater set of possibilities for people, wealthy or not, to participate in the public culture, as donor, to you know, wearing a pink ribbon in the fight against breast cancer, as causes for the fight of HIV/AIDS or famine in Africa or in Ethiopia, that more and more people got invested in good things. And that on balance, the record was positive. The opioid crisis, of course, a major disaster and I think to the extent that the Sackler family has to pay the price, yes, they do have to pay the price.
But what about the organization, the recipient organizations, taking their names off, giving back the money? What's your opinion about that?
You know, this is also a larger issue there. I just lived in Virginia through the removal of all the statues in Richmond, Charlottesville. Should they stay? Should they be moved, or should they be melted? You know, because that's the movement right now to mail the statues. How much are we? Princeton removed the Woodrow Wilson's name from the Woodrow Wilson School. I personally don't like it. Now, we shouldn't keep to the. I think that I mean, to give you my opinion, did the museum remove the Sackler Museum? Is this done? I don't know. Do you know that for sure?
I just read that some names are being taken down. I thought some of the cultural institutions in New
Remove
York
them.
have taken the name.
Well,
I think in Yale they did.
in Yale they did.
Library.
Yale,
That was the beginning of the article that I read.
yeah, Yale
The
they
New
did.
York article.
I don't know about the Sackler museums in all I can say is that it is in the hands of the trustees.
But one, when you give the example of taking down statues
Yeah, well, that would be your
but
personal.
that's a government issue. This is, I'm talking about from the philanthropy side.
Well, it's a government issue, but it could be, yeah, well, I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
I mean, I think it's a
What's your
question.
opinion?
Well, I think I will keep my opinion to myself here because I don't have, I don't have the, no, but I think because it's my right. It's my right. I cannot just give an opinion without having necessarily studied each particular case. And so therefore I cannot give you that in principle. I am against this for all of it or against it. I'm not against removing a name in principle. But being asked about a particular case, I have to say, it's just a bit, yeah.
Do you think that has this happened before?
I don't know.
I'm going to exercise a moderator's privilege to pose his own question. So very early on in your talk, you made to me what I thought was a fascinating point about how in the early 20th century, the focus of American philanthropy shifted in a sense from generosity to investment.
Yes.
That we were going to solve problems. Instead of giving people fish, we were going to investigate the manufacture of cheap nets.
Yeah. Oh, talk them about the fish.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, first of all, was that parallel elsewhere in the Western world, to your knowledge? This move from a certain kind of traditional charity towards a focus on philanthropy as investment?
I think it's yeah. It's. Do you need to translate this for your audience?
No, I think that they'll have heard me well.
I actually think this is an American innovation. That is to say, throughout history, from Roman times to the invention of modern philanthropy in America, the difference was between a gift and a sale. And that if there is a major invention in the creation of modern philanthropy, is thinking of a gift as an investment. That I can answer positively.
And now that so much charity has become essentially government subcontracting work,
Yeah.
what's happened to the investment angle? In this case, at least the investor becomes the government instead of the philanthropy, which is simply becoming the agent, the contractor, what have you.
Yeah, that is a very big issue. Now, there are still, I think here I want to believe, not that I know that, I want to believe that there's still room for you and me and other people to make their mark. But I realize that it's an act of faith. I also want to make sure that we shouldn't give too much credit to the government for their capacity of innovating. And therefore, they very much rely still on a lot of individual energy and creativity that may be completely outside of their realms and ranks for for innovation.
Right, so there's still room for philanthropical
Yes.
entrepreneurship.
I think so.
Yes.
Just to continue that discussion, one of the things I always thought about the progressive era, the progressives, is that they were so earnest and so believed that they could impact, they could eliminate poverty and they could get rid of disease and social injustice and all those things. But it seemed to me they were not very efficient at
Yeah.
what they did.
You have-
Perhaps government having more management of, or local government, municipal government, state government, having more money, having more management of the money, of the philanthropic funds, perhaps did that perhaps aid in the efficiency of addressing some of these very deep, complex problems that are not going away. You know, we still have poverty, we still have social injustice, we still have disease, we have all those things that the progressives were combating, still here.
So the question is about the relative efficiency, as it were, of the private investment versus the government investment later on. Is that a
Yes.
fair? Yes.
Well, you are perfectly right about the progressives. What's amazing about them is that for them, knowing was solving. In a sense, if you had the survey, you had the answer. So that's why you have all this survey research going on in progressive. I don't have your trust in expertise following this. I think we've had moments of great expertise, but we've lived through so many crises of expertise in the last several years that you just really wonder how we manage to have some successes before. I think we are, and it's way beyond philanthropy here. I think we have to reinvent Fordism. That's my opinion on this. Reinvent Fordism to emerge from the crisis we're in. And we have to that this idea. I mean, you know, I wrote this book on the American century just at the end of the Cold War, where it seems that there was no alternative model. I mean, after all, the Japanese were no longer dominating the economy. We're exporting the American model everywhere. Soviet Union had collapsed. It was just before the war on terror. I mean, I was at Dulles Airport on the day the Afghan airplanes and the Afghan transport planes came back. You know, what a disaster that is. So you wonder how 1.7 million soldiers showed up in Europe in 1917. So a question of efficiency is one that I can't even begin to tackle it, but you're right with it. I mean, that is what we have to do.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions?
Just, it's not an easy one, but could you talk a little bit about, or just American philanthropic efforts versus European philanthropic efforts? Are we more generous country than most European countries? In your experience, you're European.
Well, I don't know that we are more generous, because I think that's a misnomer, because in building the welfare state, and Alan and Sarah who live in France know more than me about this, but the European populations are very generous indirectly. I mean, they accept this idea of solidarity through the state in a way that we do not. So I think this notion that American philanthropists keep repeating that, hey, we're so generous compared to Europe, is really a self-gratification, congratulation. That is not true. But as I have given there's a French edition of this book, and I've given many talks in France about American philanthropy, and one thing that I've had to explain over and over again is that American philanthropy that philanthropy in France, if they were to develop it, is not to reinforce the welfare state. It's that American philanthropy is not welfare. It's something else. Has to do with science, with education, with discoveries, with investment, but it doesn't have to do with welfare. And they don't get it. So I think there is a movement to increase philanthropy. I know in European countries. I went to a talk in Sweden 10 years ago or so, about the future of the welfare state in Sweden, and they wanted to know what was the philanthropic future and how they could use philanthropic forces. And I said, America is not the example for that. You know, you're talking about different animals there.
Thank you on that note of the essential differences between American and European approaches to philanthropy. I'd like to thank all those who've attended, either in person or through Zoom, and to once more thank Professor Zunz for his participation in our series. Thank you very much.
Thank you.